Pause for a moment, not because something dramatic is about to happen, but because something already has. That feeling you had when this message began, that quiet pause inside your chest, that subtle recognition that wasn't coincidence, that was awareness. And awareness doesn't announce itself loudly. It doesn't crash in. It doesn't demand attention. It arrives gently and then it rearranges everything. If you've been hearing people say, "You've changed," this section is for you. Because what they're noticing isn't a loss, it's a shift, and most people don't know how to name it. Let's start here. For a long time, you lived in reaction mode. Not because you were weak, not because you lacked intelligence, but because you were emotionally available in a world that rewards access, not balance. You responded quickly. You explained yourself fully. You tried to smooth tension. You absorbed moods, expectations, and unspoken pressure, and people got used to that version of you. So when that version stops showing up, they don't call it growth. They call it distance. They say, "You're colder. You don't care like you used to. You're detached." But here's the truth they can't see yet. You didn't become detached. You stopped reacting automatically, and that difference matters more than they realize. Let's clarify something important early on. There is a massive difference between emotional shutdown and emotional regulation. Shutdown is numbness, regulation is awareness. Shutdown is avoidance, regulation is choice. Shutdown disconnects you from yourself, regulation reconnects you to yourself. What changed in you wasn't your capacity to feel. It was your relationship with your feelings. You stopped letting emotions hijack your direction. And when that happens, people who were accustomed to emotional access feel it immediately. Because access is power. For a long time, your emotional openness made you predictable. People knew how to get a reaction, how to pull reassurance, how to trigger guilt, how to draw you into explanation. Not always maliciously, often unconsciously, but when you stop reacting on cue, the script breaks, and broken scripts make people uncomfortable. That's where the misunderstanding begins. They assume silence means resentment. They assume calm means indifference. They assume boundaries mean rejection, because they've never learned how to interpret regulation. Here's the line you need to hear clearly. Detachment isn't distance, it's discernment. You didn't step away from people. You stepped closer to your inner compass. And that shift feels cold only to those who benefited from your over-giving. Think about it. When you were always available, your time was flexible. Your energy was negotiable. Your boundaries were porous. That created comfort for others but cost you clarity. So when you start choosing yourself internally, the external dynamic changes. Not because you're punishing anyone, but because you're no longer abandoning yourself. And that's the part people struggle with, because your growth removes roles they didn't know they were relying on you to play. You're no longer the emotional regulator for the room, the peacemaker at your own expense, the one who smooths over discomfort, the one who reacts so others don't have to reflect. And when that stops, some people feel exposed. They feel the absence of the emotional labor you used to provide. So instead of asking, "Why do I feel uncomfortable?" they ask, "Why did you change?" But here's the reframe. You didn't change who you are. You changed how much access others have to you. And access always feels like closeness until it's gone. Let's talk about reactions for a moment. Reacting isn't strength, it's speed. And speed without direction drains energy. When someone says something provocative and you immediately respond, that's not power, that's reflex. When a situation arises and your nervous system spikes before your mind engages, that's not authenticity, that's conditioning. For a long time, your system was trained to respond quickly because it once needed to, maybe to stay safe, maybe to be accepted, maybe to avoid conflict, maybe to feel valued. But now, something different is happening. You're pausing, you're noticing sensations before responding. You're letting emotions pass without becoming commands. You're choosing responses instead of releasing reactions. That's not detachment. That's maturity. And maturity feels strange in environments that are built on immediacy. Here's something most people never get taught. When you regulate yourself, you disrupt emotional economies. Some relationships are built entirely on exchange. You react, they feel important. You explain gay, they feel justified. You engage, they feel validated. When those reactions stop, the relationship has to evolve or dissolve. And not everyone is ready for evolution. So they label your regulation as withdrawal. But listen carefully. You didn't withdraw from connection. You withdrew from compulsion. You stopped being available on demand. And demand-based access isn't intimacy, it's dependency. This is where people get confused. They assume closeness equals constant emotional availability. But real closeness respects rhythm, timing, and choice. You're not less personal, and intention doesn't look loud. It looks calm. It looks selective. It looks steady. Which brings us to the hardest truth of this section. Growth often feels cold to people who are still living reactively. Because when you're no longer pulled into drama, drama loses its mirror. When you don't escalate, escalation looks lonely. When you don't over-explain, others have to sit with uncertainty. And uncertainty is uncomfortable for people who rely on emotional certainty to feel safe. So they test you, they poke, They provoke. They say things they know used to get a rise, not always consciously, but because part of them wants the old dynamic back, and when you don't bite, the discomfort increases. That's when labels appear: detached, cold, distant, changed. But here's the internal truth. You didn't go numb, you went inward. You stopped outsourcing your center. And the moment you stop reacting automatically, your energy changes. It becomes quieter but heavier, softer but more grounded, still but unmistakably present. This is the beginning of self-direction. And self-direction always gets misread at first. Because people are used to motion, they're not used to orientation, they're used to reaction, not regulation. Noise, not nuance, so they interpret your calm as absence. But it's not absence, it's alignment, and alignment doesn't announce itself, it just holds. That's why this phase feels unfamiliar even to you. You might notice. You don't rush to respond. You don't feel the need to clarify everything. You're less emotionally pulled by situations. You observe before engaging. And sometimes you wonder, am I becoming detached or am I becoming clearer? Let me answer that directly. If you still feel deeply, but act selectively, you're not detached, you're discerning. And discernment is the foundation of everything that comes next. There was a time when your emotions ran the show, not because you were weak, not because you lacked intelligence, but because no one ever taught you how to lead yourself from the inside. Most people are raised to react, not to regulate, to respond instantly, not intentionally, to feel something and act on it immediately, without pause, without reflection. That's emotional dependency, and it doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks like being nice. Sometimes it looks like over-explaining. Sometimes it looks like constantly checking how others feel before deciding how you feel. Emotional dependency means your inner world is outsourced. Your peace depends on how others behave. Your confidence depends on how others respond. Your decisions depend on approval, reassurance, or urgency. You're not living from direction, you're living from stimulus. Someone is distant, key, you feel anxious. Someone disapproves, you feel unworthy. Someone reacts strongly, you react back. It's not conscious, it's automatic. And for a long time, that automatic mode felt normal. But something shifted. Not suddenly, not loudly, quietly. You started noticing the gap between feeling something and acting on it. At first, that gap felt uncomfortable, almost unnatural. You'd feel the urge to respond, but you didn't. You'd feel the pull to explain, but you paused. You'd feel the spike of emotion, and instead of releasing it outward, you stayed with it. That's the beginning of self-direction. Self-direction doesn't mean you stopped feeling. It means feelings stopped driving the vehicle. There's a difference between emotion as information and emotion as command. Before, emotions issued orders. Now, emotions deliver messages and you decide what to do with them. That's not detachment, that's leadership. This is where many people misunderstand you. They think you became distant because you stopped reacting. But what actually happened is deeper. Your nervous system stopped living in survival mode. For years, your body was trained to scan for threat, rejection, instability. Your reactions weren't personality flaws, they were survival strategies: appeasing, explaining, fixing, over-engaging. Those strategies once kept you safe. But safety is not the same as direction. As you grew, your system began to rewire. You learned, maybe unconsciously, how to regulate. Regulation is the ability to stay present with emotion without being consumed by it. And regulation changes everything. When your nervous system calms, your brain shifts control. You move from the limbic system, emotion and threat, to the prefrontal cortex, choice, planning, perspective. This is why your behavior changed. You don't rush responses anymore. You don't argue reflexively. You don't feel the same urgency to correct, defend, or prove. Not because you don't care, but because urgency is no longer steering you. Self-directed people don't outsource their inner compass. They don't need someone else's reaction to tell them who they are. They don't need emotional intensity to feel alive. They don't need conflict to feel engaged. They act from values, not volatility. This shift can feel lonely at first, because emotional dependency creates constant interaction. High emotional exchange, high drama, high reassurance loops. Self-direction is quieter. It has fewer spikes, fewer explanations, fewer emotional negotiations. To people who still live reactively, quiet feels like distance. But what they're sensing isn't your absence, it's your autonomy. You no longer let other people's emotions override your direction. That's threatening to systems built on emotional access. Some people were used to influencing you through guilt, some through urgency, some through chaos. When those levers stop working, confusion follows. They may say you've changed, they may say you're cold, they may say you're detached. But what they're really experiencing is loss of control. Self-direction means you decide your responses in advance, internally. You don't wake up and ask, how do I feel today? You ask, what matters today? You don't ask, how do they see me? You ask, am I aligned with myself? This doesn't mean emotions disappear. You still feel disappointment. You still feel sadness. You still feel anger. But now emotions move through you, not from you. You feel them fully, without letting them choose your behavior. That's power, not loud power, not dominating power, quiet power, the kind that doesn't need to announce itself. This is why fewer reactions create more influence. When you stop reacting instantly, people listen more closely. When you stop explaining, your words carry weight. When you stop chasing emotional resolution, your presence stabilizes the room. Because self-directed people regulate the emotional field around them. They don't escalate, they don't mirror chaos, they don't absorb other people's anxiety. They hold their center, and that center becomes an anchor. This is the psychological truth most people never learn. Freedom doesn't come from expressing every emotion. Freedom comes from choosing which emotions deserve expression. You didn't suppress yourself. You refined yourself. You didn't disconnect. You differentiated, you learned where you end and others begin, and that boundary is not a wall, it's a compass. Now, instead of asking, how should I respond? You ask, does responding align with who I'm becoming? Instead of reacting to tone, you respond to meaning. Instead of reacting to pressure, you move by principle. That's why your energy feels different, not less emotional, more intentional. And yes, this makes some people uncomfortable, because self-directed individuals remind others of what they've avoided, inner responsibility. When you stop outsourcing your emotional regulation, you stop needing someone else to manage your inner world. That's independence at the deepest level, and once you taste that, there's no going back. Something subtle shifted in the way people experience you. Not because you announced a change, not because you confronted anyone, but because your presence no longer plays the same role in their emotional world. And that's what makes it uncomfortable. Most relationships are built on unspoken emotional contracts. Who reacts, who reassures, who absorbs tension, who smooths things over, who provides emotional access on demand. For a long time, you fulfilled a role in those contracts. You listened quickly, you responded deeply, you explained yourself often, you adjusted your energy to keep the connection stable. That role made others feel safe. Not because it was healthy, but because it was familiar. When you became more self-directed, you didn't break the contract, you outgrew it. And expired contracts create discomfort, not closure. People don't always know why they feel uneasy around you now. They just sense something is different. You're calmer, less reactive, more grounded. And calm has a strange effect on unregulated systems. It exposes what used to be hidden. When someone is chaotic inside, your stability feels like judgment, even when it isn't. When someone is emotionally dependent, your boundaries feel like rejection, even when they aren't. When someone relied on emotional access to feel connected, your neutrality feels like distance. But the truth is simple. You didn't withdraw. The old dynamics expired. This is where the energy mismatch begins. You're operating from internal regulation. They're still operating from external feedback. You move slowly and deliberately. They move urgently and reactively. You pause before responding. They fill silence with anxiety, and silence is the first thing that starts to feel threatening. Silence removes emotional cues, it removes reassurance, it removes immediate validation. For insecure systems, silence equals danger. So some people try to provoke you, they ask sharper questions, they make subtle accusations, they test boundaries. Not because they want conflict, but because they want reaction. Reaction reassures them that the old access still exists, that they can still pull emotional energy from you on demand. When you don't respond the way you used to, confusion turns into discomfort. They may say things like, "You're so quiet lately, you don't care anymore, you've changed." But what they really mean is, "I don't know how to locate myself in relation to you anymore." Your presence no longer organizes their emotional state, and that forces them to face their own. This is why calm exposes chaos. Your regulation highlights their dysregulation without a word spoken. You don't need to criticize, you don't need to confront. Your nervous system speaks louder than language. A regulated person creates contrast, and contrast makes people aware of their own patterns. Some respond with curiosity, some respond with resistance. Those who are ready will lean in, they'll ask questions, they'll respect your pace. Those who aren't will feel threatened. Because self-directed people are mirrors, not manipulators. You're no longer matching energy to maintain comfort. You're holding energy to maintain truth. And truth isn't always soothing. Another reason people feel uncomfortable is loss of predictability. You used to be emotionally readable. They knew what would trigger you. They knew how you'd respond. They knew what tone would pull you in. Predictability gives people a sense of control. When your reactions slow down, that control disappears. You don't escalate, you don't justify, you don't chase. And that lack of response creates a vacuum. Vacuum forces self-awareness. And self-awareness is uncomfortable for those who've avoided it. This is especially true for people who were used to emotional leverage. They may feel ignored, even though you're present. They may feel dismissed, even though you're listening. They may feel abandoned, even though you're simply not over-functioning. Because what's missing isn't connection, it's access. Access to your emotional labor, access to your reassurance, access to your over-explaining. You stop providing those things automatically. An automatic emotional supply is addictive. When it's removed, withdrawal symptoms appear. irritation, projection, blame. This is why some people suddenly question your character. They don't say, I miss the old dynamic. They say, you're different now. Difference feels like loss when entitlement was involved. But not everyone reacts negatively. Some people feel calmer around you now. They feel grounded, seen, respected. Because regulated presence creates safety for those who want to grow. They don't need emotional chaos to feel alive. They don't need constant reassurance to feel connected. They meet you where you are. This is how you know who belongs in this phase of your life. Not by who demands access, but by who respects boundaries. Not by who needs reaction, but by who values presence. Your silence isn't empty. It's full of discernment. You're no longer engaging to soothe insecurity, yours or theirs. You're engaging from choice. And choice is threatening to people who rely on unconscious patterns. This is the deeper reason some people feel unsettled around you. Your system no longer participates in emotional games. You don't escalate tension. You don't chase validation. You don't reward manipulation with attention. That breaks cycles. And broken cycles feel like instability to those invested in them. But from your perspective, something else is happening. Life feels clearer. Interactions feel simpler. You're not exhausted after conversations anymore, because you're no longer managing other people's inner worlds. You're responsible for your own, and that's enough. You didn't withdraw, you realigned. And realignment always reveals who is connected to you versus who is connected to the role you played. This phase isn't about isolation. It's about accuracy, about seeing clearly, about recognizing which relationships were built on mutual presence and which were built on emotional dependency. And once you see that, you stop explaining, you stop defending. You let the discomfort exist without taking responsibility for it. Because other people's discomfort with your growth is not your regression. It's their invitation. Whether they accept it or not is up to them. At some point in this phase, you stop asking, what's wrong with me? And you start noticing something quieter, steadier, and far more important. Your life is no longer being pulled by noise. You're not numb. You're not disconnected. You're not avoiding life. You're leading it from the inside. Self-direction doesn't announce itself with confidence or certainty. It shows up as subtle behavioral shifts that feel almost anticlimactic. No dramatic breakthroughs, no external validation, just a calm sense of alignment. One of the first signs is how quickly you disengage. Not because you don't care, but because you finally know what deserves your energy. You don't argue to be understood anymore. You notice when a conversation is about connection versus control. You sense when someone is listening to respond rather than to understand. And instead of proving your point, you step back. That alone is a massive indicator of self-direction. Because people who are externally driven need agreement to feel stable. Self-directed people don't. They understand that understanding is mutual, not forced. Another sign is how little you chase closure. You used to want the final conversation, the explanation, the apology, the mutual acknowledgement. Now you recognize something deeper. Closure doesn't come from agreement. It comes from integration. You don't need people to validate your experience for it to be real. You trust your internal processing. That trust is earned through consistency with yourself. Self-directed people move even when no one claps. They don't wait for permission. They don't wait for perfect clarity. They act from internal alignment rather than external approval. This doesn't make you impulsive. It makes you intentional. You pause, but you don't freeze. You reflect, but you don't ruminate. You choose and then you move. Another powerful sign is how your goals feel. They're quieter now. Less about proving something, less about being seen, more about coherence. Your goals are internally powered. Even when progress is slow, it doesn't shake you. Because your motivation isn't fueled by urgency or comparison. It's fueled by direction. Self-direction changes how you experience time. You're not in a rush, but you're not stuck either. You understand that momentum doesn't always feel fast. Sometimes it feels inevitable. Another sign is emotional recovery time. You still feel things deeply, but you return to baseline faster. You don't spiral as long. You don't personalize as much. You don't catastrophize. This isn't suppression. It's nervous system regulation. Your prefrontal cortex is online. You can feel emotion without becoming it. That's self-direction in its most practical form. You're no longer hijacked by old survival responses. You respond instead of react. This shows up in conflict. You don't escalate to feel powerful. You don't withdraw to feel safe. You stay present. You may speak less, but with more precision. And when something doesn't align, you exit cleanly. No dramatics, no emotional depth. Another clear sign is how validation feels unnecessary. Not unwanted, just unnecessary. Praise doesn't inflate you. Criticism doesn't collapse you. You listen to feedback without outsourcing your worth. You decide what fits. This inner stability makes you harder to manipulate. You don't need to win. You don't need to be right. You need to be aligned, that's it. Self-direction also changes your relationship with solitude. Being alone doesn't feel lonely. It feels clarifying. Silence becomes a resource rather than a threat. You process, you integrate, you recalibrate, and when you re-enter the world, you do so deliberately. Not everyone gets access anymore, and that's not arrogance, it's discernment. Here's an important distinction. Self-direction is not isolation. Isolation is avoidance. Self-direction is leadership. You still connect. You still care. You still contribute. But you don't abandon yourself to maintain access. You choose relationships that respect pace, depth, and boundaries. Another sign, you're comfortable being misunderstood. Not because it doesn't hurt, but because you trust timing. You know that forcing clarity too early creates distortion. You let people meet you where they are. If they misunderstand you, you don't chase their perception. You stay rooted. That's emotional maturity. Self-directed people are not rigid. They're responsive. They adapt without losing center. They change course without losing identity. And perhaps the most telling sign, your life feels quieter but more effective. You do fewer things, but they matter more. Your energy is concentrated. Your commitments are clean. Your actions align with your values. There's less noise, less drama, less emotional waste, and more forward movement. You're no longer motivated by fear of loss. You're motivated by fidelity to your inner compass. That compass wasn't always clear. It was built through discomfort, reflection, and self-honesty, through choosing regulation over reaction, through choosing direction over distraction. Self-direction doesn't make you superior. It makes you responsible. Responsible for your energy, your choices, your trajectory. And that responsibility feels empowering, not heavy. Because you're no longer carrying what was never yours to hold. This is how you know you're truly self-directed. Your life feels internally led, even when the outside world is uncertain. And that kind of leadership can't be faked. It can only be lived. This phase isn't random, and it isn't permanent, it's preparatory. Self-direction is not the destination, it's the calibration stage before expansion. Right now, your life may feel quieter than before, less crowded, more intentional. That's because alignment creates space, and space is where momentum is built. When you stop reacting to everything, when you stop over-explaining, you free clarity. When you stop chasing validation, you free direction. That energy doesn't disappear, it consolidates. And consolidation always comes before acceleration. One of the first things this phase prepares you for is precision. You're learning what to say yes to, and more importantly, what to decline without guilt. Your time becomes protected. Your attention becomes focused. Your standards become embodied rather than spoken. This precision changes the quality of opportunities that approach you. Not more opportunities, better ones. Aligned people don't rush into your life. They arrive later. Because alignment moves slower than urgency, but faster than chaos. This phase teaches you patience without passivity. You're not waiting. You're positioning. Another thing this phase prepares you for is clean momentum. In the past, movement was driven by emotion, fear, excitement, proving something. Now movement is driven by coherence. You move because something fits, not because it stimulates you. This creates sustainable momentum, the kind that doesn't burn you out. You begin to notice something interesting. When you move from alignment, resistance decreases. Not because life becomes easy, but because your energy is no longer split. You're not dragging old attachments into new phases. You're traveling lighter. That lightness is magnetic. This phase also prepares you for value-matched relationships. People who are used to chaos won't find you interesting anymore. And that's okay. You're no longer compatible with dynamics that require emotional volatility to function. Instead, people who arrive now tend to feel familiar. Not dramatic, not intense, just resonant. Conversations feel grounded, boundaries feel mutual, silence feels comfortable. These relationships don't drain you, they expand you. And they often come after periods of solitude. Solitude isn't punishment, it's filtration. Life removes what no longer matches before it introduces what does. Another preparation happening right now is leadership. Not loud leadership, not performative leadership, anchored leadership. When you're self-directed, people feel it. They may not be able to name it, but your presence regulates. You don't fix people. You don't rescue, you model stability, and stability is rare. In a reactive world, regulated energy stands out. People begin to trust you. Not because you talk the most, but because you don't panic. This phase prepares you to be an anchor in teams, families, partnerships, and communities. Not by carrying others, but by not collapsing under pressure. Another subtle preparation is legacy thinking. Your decisions begin to extend beyond immediate gratification. You ask different questions now. Does this align long-term? Will this cost me myself? Is this sustainable? You start thinking in seasons rather than moments. That's maturity. That's self-respect. That's leadership over your own life. You're also being prepared for selective visibility. Not everyone needs access to you. And not every chapter needs to be documented. You learn that privacy is power, that momentum grows faster when it's not constantly observed. This doesn't mean hiding. It means choosing when and where you show up, strategically. Self-directed people don't announce every move, they execute quietly. Then results speak. This phase also recalibrates your relationship with effort. You stop glorifying struggle. You stop confusing exhaustion with progress. You choose effectiveness over effort. This doesn't make you lazy, it makes you precise. You work smarter because you're not compensating for misalignment. You rest without guilt, you move without force, and you trust timing. Perhaps the most important thing this phase prepares you for is impact without self-betrayal. In the past, impact came at a cost. Overgiving, overfunctioning, over-explaining. Now, impact comes from presence, from clarity, from boundaries. You no longer sacrifice yourself to be useful. You remain intact. And that integrity amplifies everything you touch. Your work becomes cleaner. Your relationships become healthier. Your decisions become faster. Because you're no longer negotiating with your inner compass. This phase also dismantles false urgency. You realize that not everything requires a response. That silence can be a strategy. That stillness can be movement. You stop confusing pressure with importance. And this creates emotional sovereignty. You're not rushed by other people's timelines. You move when it's right, not when it's loud. And here's something many people don't realize it. This phase is not lonely, it's selective. Loneliness comes from lack of connection. Selectivity comes from discernment. You still connect deeply, but only where energy is reciprocal, only where values align, only where growth is mutual. That's not detachment, that's wisdom. You're also being prepared for longer arcs of success. Quick wins lose meaning when they cost alignment. You're building something slower and stronger. Something that doesn't collapse under pressure. Something that doesn't require constant maintenance. Something that grows because it's rooted. This phase strengthens your roots. So when expansion comes, and it will, you don't uproot yourself to reach it. Finally, this phase prepares you to trust yourself fully. Not perfectly, fully. You know you can pause, you know you can pivot, you know you can walk away, and you know you can commit deeply when something is right. That self-trust changes everything. Because when you trust yourself, you stop outsourcing direction. And when direction is internal, life responds differently. This is not a waiting room, this is a training ground. And what you're becoming in this quiet season will determine how far you can go when things get loud again. You're not detached, you're not cold, you're not lost, you're led from within. And that kind of leadership creates a life that doesn't need constant correction. It moves forward on purpose. If this video felt personal, pause for a moment. Not because you need to react, but because something in you recognized itself. You're not imagining the shift you've been feeling. You didn't become distant. You didn't lose your heart. You didn't fall off your path. You learned how to lead yourself. And self-leadership is quiet. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't ask for permission. It simply changes how you move. If this message resonated, comment 777, not as a symbol, not as a ritual, but as a reminder that you're choosing direction over distraction. Subscribe if you want content that respects your intelligence, clarity without fear, strength without aggression, and growth without losing yourself. And if you know someone who carries quiet strength, who's been misunderstood because they stopped reacting, share this with them. They won't need an explanation, they'll understand immediately.